Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 20th episode of the Temple Podcast. I've actually made a note to remember this one because it's a round number and I'm good with round numbers. But to celebrate the amazingness that is that I've reached 20 episodes of this, I went and grabbed none other than the face of ESL Australia, Jordan Elfishguy Mays. How are you, mate?
I'm pretty good. I'm not so sure how ESL Australia would feel giving me that kind of a title, but I suppose it's not too far from the truth because I'm on the majority of the broadcast nowadays, aren't I? So, yeah, life's good, I suppose. Can't complain.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's Elfishguy and ESL. It's almost the same thing at this point. You know, I feel like you could be the mecca that ESL can get into and sort of travel around, and that's what you've become.
I mean, there's a few other classes that we use quite a lot. I think you could definitely think of Ben Green as well. He's been on not quite as many probably as me now, but he's on the big ones. So there's also all the CS guys that we tend to use, and I think they have a lot of input in how things work in the ESL talent side of things. It's not just me.
Yeah, obviously, the political answer there. I will appreciate that. I'm sure everybody that works alongside you will appreciate it.
Last time I did a podcast like this, and I said something like commentators are the face of esports, and everyone was just giving me shit for it for like months afterwards, saying, yeah, Elfishguy, the face of esports. And now you've literally just said I'm the face of ESL. And I mean, I know that's going to come up in the future. So thanks for that.
Well, listen, I would actually agree with you, but I feel like at least if I say like ESL, it kind of makes sense. But I've never understood why that wouldn't be the case. I mean, you see our faces quite a lot, so
indeed.
Anyway, we're going to throw straight into it because I want to go. The general way that I structure this is I go through just your career so far, and then we'll go to esports, and then we'll finish off with the LAN that's coming up, the ESL AUNZ LAN, because that will be something that I'm sure people would like to see your predictions for. But before we get to that, I will go to talking about your career, because you've been doing this for a very long time, and I think you were doing it before I even started looking at the Australian scene. So can we talk about that then? So where did you start when it came to esports?
I think when I first sort of looked at esports and wanted to get into it was at PAX 2013, which was the first PAX here in Australia. Back then I was a big LoL kid. I was a big fan of LoL. Prior to that, I'd played a little bit of competitive Team Fortress 2 and a bit of competitive Star Wars Battlefront 2, but those were sort of like minor things. League of Legends was the first game where I like really went hardcore into. And I was watching, there was like a LoL stand or a Riot booth or whatever it was at that pack. They had like the OPL, or before the OPL, it was before the OPL. It was like the very first Oceanic tournament. I don't even remember what it was called. But Papa Smithy and Pastry Time were casting that, and I was in the front row of the crowd every day. I got there 9 a.m. in the morning, sat in the crowd for 5 or 6 hours waiting for the actual esports thing to start. So that was when I was watching that, I was thinking, this is pretty cool. I'm keen on this. And so, push came to shove, I started streaming on my own channel and that kind of thing. And inevitably, it went from one small thing to the next small thing to then sort of some medium-sized things and then some bigger things. I mean, it's a long story, so I don't know if I want to bore you with all the details, but suffice to say, it started in League of Legends. That went for a year or a couple of years, and then I moved into Counter-Strike, which my first big event was then the Crown 55K Invitational, which was the one that Cloud9 MVP came to. And I think that was what sort of really sparked it for me. And after that, very quickly, I went into an event in China for Crossfire, and I'm still doing the Crossfire events in China to this day. So those two events, I would say, are the ones that sort of really made me go from seeing it as more of a hobby and something that was kind of fun on the side to being like, you know what, if I can do this as a job and do this for the rest of my life, then maybe I'll try and do that.
Yeah, I mean, the crown is definitely a throwback, because I remember that's back when I was foolish enough to believe, man, we're going to qualify for the crown, dude. It's going to be amazing. We're going to play PvP. Of course, never even came close. So that was definitely an interesting time period.
I think you can look back at that event and there's a few people's sort of careers in a way that were launched from that. I know having spoken to Brainstorm, obviously he casts a lot with us nowadays at ESL, but that was like the event that he went to, and he spoke to myself and Mike and Wooly and Ben and all that, just as a spectator, and like didn't really have any expectations of being a commentator, as far as I understand at the time. But that was the one where he sort of said, you know what, I will try and do this, and that's pushed him along. And obviously now look where he is. He's actually over in China right now commentating PUBG Mobile. I don't know if you know that, but these things happen, and like all it takes is that one event that sort of flicks the switch, and then off you go.
Yeah, it's a crazy world to live in, because it's so like 0 to 100, I guess. It's nothing, and then you get one, and then now we're a part of this. So it's definitely a crazy thing. Now, you said before that you actually started really trying to go hard in League of Legends as like a competitive thing. Now, do you think that that's in your experience a very common thing in commentators, that most commentators start out trying to play competitively and then sort of transition that into commentating?
I suppose it is. I think just to get into esports in general, you have to at some point have an interest in playing competitively.
Yeah.
It's not just necessarily a thing for commentators. I think you can look at the majority of the guys that work at ESL nowadays come from a competitive Halo background. So even Nick Vanzetti, he was a competitive Halo player, right? So I think in our industry, it's just a thing that sort of starts you off, and obviously only so many people can make it as a professional player, or have the drive or the grind to make it as a professional player, or whether or not you believe that there's some sort of genetics involved as to whether or not you just are a better player in general from some whatever freak of nature you are. There's also that maybe that involved, exactly. So yeah, some people don't have the time, some people maybe don't have the skill just in general, but everyone sort of finds their place, I suppose. And I think it all does come from initially being interested as a competitive player. I think there's very few people who just go straight into commentary or just go straight into adminning or whatever else it is that they end up doing.
Now, talking about League of Legends again, you said that was kind of the thing that sort of started off your commentary side of things. So can you tell me a little bit about how you went from just attending that event and being in the audience to then working with these guys and obviously commentating? You did commentate League of Legends, yeah?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's a pretty long story, but I suppose let's start from...
Why not?
Obviously, like I said, we go from PAX, right? PAX Australia 2013. I'm sitting there watching Papa Smithy and Pastry Time thinking, damn, this looks sick. I'd really like to try this out. And then I was watching some of the online broadcasts from the Oceanic scene, which was back in the day when Cybergamer was like the place to be for esports in Australia. So we had the Cybergamer Premier League, the Open Leagues, and whatever intermediate main, I can't remember what they were all called. But there was a few guys casting for that, and they were casting for Team Down TV, and I've told this story before. And I was watching them, I was thinking, you know what, these guys aren't that good, like why do they get to cast these good games, which were at the time seemed good, but they weren't really. And I was thinking, why do they get to cast these good games and I don't? So I just sort of started doing it, which at the time and even still, I guess to the day when Cybergamer closed, was not necessarily what you were supposed to do, because you had to have permissions to cast certain games on the CG platform, and you had to be part of a casting org. Which I wasn't. I was just casting on my own channel. So at that time, then when I was doing that, Cyanide and Menace, I believe, kind of caught on to what I was doing. And at the time, Cyanide was obviously quite involved with CG. Not to the point where he was sort of like managing everything like he did in the later years, but he was quite involved. And he owned / had created Team Down TV with Sandman. And so Cyanide and Menace called me out on it, and I was like, shit. Being whatever, I don't know, maybe 17, 18 at the time, thought I was in trouble, thought I'd done something bad. But they said, look, if you want to come and cast for Team Down TV. And at the time, I was pretty bin tier of a commentator. But I got that, and I started casting with them. And obviously back then, and probably still for the majority of people nowadays doing it online, it was free, didn't get paid anything, grinded out 3 or 4 nights a week doing League of Legends, Cybergamer Open, Cybergamer Main, and sometimes the Premier stuff. And eventually we did some LANs. Obviously the Cybergamer LANs were a big thing back in the day. And that was also where I started to sort of look at Counter-Strike as well, because at the time League of Legends was the big game and Counter-Strike was sort of just starting to come through. There wasn't any established Counter-Strike commentators, and I was casting with Uber Shouts, who does Overwatch League at the time for League of Legends. He started to move into Counter-Strike, but then he inevitably went overseas to work at ESL in Cologne. And that is kind of what allowed me to then move into Counter-Strike and fill the void that he had left. And we started really hitting the Counter-Strike hard because League of Legends had then been taken over by Riot. And so Team Down TV went from being a primarily League of Legends broadcasting organization into then moving to Counter-Strike. And from there, my first Counter-Strike LAN, the PDG Invitational with Mav. Shout out to Mav for buying me my copy of Counter-Strike. I said I wouldn't cast Counter-Strike unless he bought it for me. So look where we've gone from there. And then obviously, we did that first LAN. Did a couple of ACLs, which was what ESL was before they became ESL. And obviously ESL was partly to produce that Crown event. So that was where that networking kind of came in for myself and Sandman. We'd done the the ACLs, sorry. We did then the Crown. And then inevitably ESL became a thing here in Sydney. And from there, they were looking for World of Tanks commentators. Now at the time, I was not a World of Tanks commentator, but I was a commentator and I did want a job in esports. And I had at some point played World of Tanks, which was something that not many people had done, or at least not many commentators had done. So inevitably I got the job partly due to that, partly due to networking and knowing the right people and being in the right place at the right time. Now, unfortunately, World of Tanks is dead, but CSGO is still chugging along quite nicely. And that's the whole story.
Sweet.
But quite a sped up version of it, I suppose.
A sped up version. Well, I wanted to talk to you because obviously you're, I don't know how many casters or commentators would have done both League of Legends and Counter-Strike. But did you focus more color in League of Legends or were you still play-by-play?
Yeah, I was a little bit more color focused in League of Legends, mostly because I was a very new commentator and I didn't have the ability to speak quite quickly enough, be able to sound interesting enough and that kind of thing when I was doing my play-by-play. And I kind of felt like I knew the game well enough, which, I mean, in hindsight, probably didn't.
Yeah.
But at the time, when you look at the caliber of the other commentators that were going around, it was kind of on the same level sort of thing. It was a very, very different, vastly different kind of a situation for esports commentary back then. And as long as you knew the ability names, you sort of were a god kind of thing.
Yeah.
Look, going back, and if I were to start now at the level that I started at then, I don't know that I would really get anywhere sort of thing because I was pretty bad. But luckily I was in there at the time where everyone was quite a lot worse than they are now. So I kind of was able to grow with the industry and didn't sort of jump in over my head, so to speak. And it helped to be with the experienced heads as well that were already there.
Yeah, fair enough. So you kind of had a lot of mentors then along the way, would you say? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, there was a lot of people that I casted with that had a lot more experience than me at the time. You would look at, obviously, Cyanide, Steve, from back in those days was probably the primary one, not as a commentator, but as a producer who gave a lot of feedback to us. Sandman, who I ended up working with a lot and still work with a lot. Uber, obviously, he was one of the premier commentators here in Australia at the time and had already started to do international work for the likes of World of Tanks. And as we know, eventually that moved into ESL. So he was definitely another one that helped out quite a lot. Atlas, Max Anderson, who works in LCK now for League of Legends, he was commentating around there as well. So we sort of worked together at times. I think those are probably the big ones that have come from Team Down TV. Menace, who he was more experienced at the time, obviously has sort of fallen off and doesn't commentate anymore, but he was definitely another one that I looked up to. And Papa Smithy and Pastry Time, although I didn't really work with them so much, but they were definitely people that I looked to sort of learn from.
What do you think are the main sort of differences then when it comes to doing like League of Legends commentary and Counter-Strike commentary? Obviously, League of Legends tends to be a little bit more complicated when it comes to you've got to know all the abilities and all the champion names and sort of, I guess, have a almost more of an eagle eye than you do with Counter-Strike, where you can kind of zone in a little bit more. But are there any other things that you can think of?
Well, I mean, I haven't cast League of Legends in a long time, so I'm not so sure that I'm 100% going to be on the mark with this one. Maybe some of the the right guys will look at this and say, what is he talking about? But to me, it feels like CSGO is quite a lot faster paced than League of Legends is as well. So there's a lot more downtime that you do tend to have to fill with LoL, which is where that extra game knowledge sort of comes from. As the color commentator in particular, you're going to have to do a lot more heavy lifting, particularly in the early game before the team fights are starting to happen. Whereas with Counter-Strike, it's very defined, right? You're going to see that 30 seconds to 45 seconds of color commentary, then you're going to see that 30 seconds of play-by-play as the round starts to end, and then you're back into freeze time where the color commentator takes over. So it's always sort of like a wave in a way. But with League of Legends, it can literally, a fight could happen literally at any point in any time. So you kind of need to be prepared to jump into anything whenever it starts to kick off. I don't think it's quite as structured as it is in Counter-Strike.
So League of Legends is kind of more peaky, whereas Counter-Strike kind of waves.
It's more of a wave.
Yeah. Fair enough. Now, I wanted to move then. Obviously, you did sort of a speed run through your career there, but I wanted to go to Counter-Strike because you were talking then about the crown, and I wanted to talk sort of because for me, when that crown event happened, that was almost obviously that's when I started watching the Australian scene. So for me, that was kind of the explosion that kind of went, oh wow, look, there's actually a whole bunch of esports going on here in Australia. Why am I not looking at this? So what was that sort of, I guess, experience like coming out of the crown?
Yeah, I mean, that was huge, wasn't it, really? Like, we'd been doing the CGs, we'd be doing the ACLs up to that point, but they were more community-driven events, like you might see maybe, I guess, from MC LANs these days. I haven't been to any of them, so I don't really know exactly what it's like, but it was sort of very much more community involved going to those initial LANs. And I think after Crown is where things started to get a little bit more serious. That's where when the ACL started to pop up and you got a few more international opportunities from those, there was more money involved. And obviously then ESL started to become a thing, and that really pushed the issue, pushed the boundaries, I suppose, with Counter-Strike quite substantially. I mean, the early days of the AU and NZ Championship when ESL started off were still quite shaky, but it kind of has developed to where it is now. So I think for a lot of people, Crown is what put esports on the map in Australia, at least from a Counter-Strike perspective. There was a lot of other stuff going on for League of Legends in that time, but really at that point in time, it really felt like League of Legends was the only one that anyone really cared about here in Australia, outside of the people that were totally into their scene, like the COD scene and the CSGO scene. But as a general rule, there wasn't like a wider audience. But Crown certainly was that one that made people sort of sit up and say, oh, this is actually something, could be something. And for me, it was really good for my career as well, because it was like a proper event, right?
Yeah.
That led to a lot of other opportunities as well.
And would you say, you said that was kind of like the spark that got you into going, okay, maybe I can actually do something with this and make it a career.
Yeah, I think that was sort of part of it. There was that Crossfire event that I went to in China as well. I don't know that many people really know or care that I cast Crossfire, but myself, Ian, and Sandman tend to do it at least once or twice a year nowadays, and it's a really good gig for us because we do get to go to China. But on that was my first ever international event. That was the first sort of taste of international esports as well, where I was like, okay, this could actually be something more than just the community tournaments, the sleeping in Menace's backyard, sharing a bedroom, sharing a bed at one point. That kind of stuff is what we used to do back in the day. But now, it's grown so much. And I think that was the first sort of light at the end of the tunnel for me to say, actually, this can become something really an eye-opener. And the flight back from China was where, I don't know if you do the same when you're on flights, but I feel like it's a sort of a melancholic experience where you do a lot of thinking. And, it was 9 p.m. at night. I was looking out at the runway in China and thinking, man, this would actually be the life. And yeah.
Yeah. I'd also do a lot of just looking around at people and going, what's going on here? Why does this smell like this? This is just absolutely outrageous. But
that's definitely part of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, planes, fun times. Now, speaking about international events, you actually did another big one of note. Now, was it Dallas or New York?
It was Dallas.
It was Dallas, right? Okay, because I remember very distinctly, Mr. Dallas was the name for a very short period of time. So how was that?
That was fun. Yeah, look, I was very jet lagged, so I probably didn't make as much out of it as I should have.
Yeah.
I was sort of the guy that woke up at 4 a.m. every morning, and I was sitting in my hotel room waiting for breakfast to open. Urcast was super jet lagged as well, so we always ended up butting heads or bumping into each other at breakfast at 6 a.m. in the morning. We were through the door as soon as it opened. But yeah, I sort of woke up at like 4 a.m. every day and went to bed at 4 p.m. every afternoon because we'd finished our broadcasts for generally pretty early. So I probably didn't make it out of it what I should have as an opportunity, if that makes sense in terms of networking. I was very, very hard to catch it most of the time. But aside from that, it was really it was a great experience again. Being able to go and do another international event is always going to be fun. So I wish I could have done more, wish I could do more. But that's the difficulty sometimes coming from Australia, that you're not always going to be the priority choice, I suppose, even the secondary or third choice. And in most instances, if you are getting those international tournaments, there's a good chance that it has gone to a multitude of people in front of you before it actually ended up coming to you. And that's the difficulty that I think a lot of the Australian commentators face, not just in Counter-Strike, but, PUBG, we're seeing the same sort of thing for Xenox. He's just managed to find his first international gig, but I feel like it's the same kind of thing for him, for the Rainbow Six guys, for Dota, all that sort of stuff. So at that time, I sort of thought, gee, this is good. I've done IEM Sydney. A month later, I'm in Dallas doing the ESL Pro League. I'm like, hang on, have I finally broken into sort of that next level? And then obviously, since then, we haven't really done, or at least I haven't really done a whole lot of international events. And the ones that I have done have been more of like the tier 2 level. So again, it was a good experience. Disappointing to look back in hindsight that it hasn't eventuated into anything else. But I think that's just how it is really for us here in Australia, because we're so isolated from everything that it's really hard to get those consistent gigs. And in fact, I think the reason that I did actually get that gig is Pansy was doing PUBG that weekend. Obviously, Sadakist was taking that break for reasons that we all know. So 2 of the main primary commentators at the time for CS were not available. I think it went to Meta's Vince, and he wasn't able to do it for some reason. Anders wasn't able to do it for some reason. And then they were like, oh, let's just get this guy that did IAM Sydney. It was a case of right place at right time. But yeah.
Have you ever thought about relocating yourself over to Europe or America?
Yeah, I have. And it was probably more a year and a half, 2 years ago, where I was sort of thinking that would be the end goal for me. My priorities have changed a little bit in the past 6 months to 12 months now, because my girlfriend has moved here to Sydney and we live together. Things are obviously looking a lot different in my life. When you're a single guy and all you care about is esports, all you want to do is esports, and your whole life is esports, it's much easier to sort of make that jump. And if I was given the opportunity at that time, I'm pretty confident that I would have taken it. I would have probably moved anywhere. Even before I actually started at ESL Australia, I had applied for a position at ESL Poland, which was for FPS commentary, which I believe was Rainbow Six or World of Tanks at the time, and may have led me on the same sort or similar path. Who knows? Personally, I think if I was living in Europe or North America or somewhere like that, opportunities would be easier to come by. But then it's also an argument of, would you be the little fish in a big pond, as opposed to here? I sort of feel like I'm a big fish in a little pond. So both sort of have their pros and cons. I like where I'm at right now. Obviously, I think for the majority of the talent, specifically for CS, but for most of the games that I cast, I think almost all of our casters are at a level where now we aren't going to necessarily get that much better without being able to do better events, if that makes sense. And we only have the IEM Sydneys once a year, the Melbourne Esports Opens once a year. You need kind of those events every couple of months sort of thing to be able to elevate yourself to be that sort of premium arena tier commentator. And we just don't get those opportunities quite as much as you would in North America and Europe, even as a tier 2 commentator, because you've got the likes of the DreamHacks, the Star Ladders, the PGLs, all that sort of stuff that goes on over there. But over here, really the only experience you can get that from is probably from ESL. And obviously, there's only so much that we can do as one tournament organizer. So look, it was a thought, probably no longer a thought, unfortunately, unless something just massive comes up. I don't want to sort of say anything that like, okay, let's just use an example, right? Overwatch League, for example. If Overwatch League came a knocking and said, "Hey, Elfishguy, we're going to pay you $150,000 a year to cast Overwatch League," I would obviously very heavily consider something like that. That's the kind of opportunity that it would have to be. But it couldn't be something that was only slightly better than what I have now, because it, to uproot my whole life is probably not what I want to be doing at this point.
Fair enough. So then broadening that out to just a more esports sort of focus there, because obviously you've been first-handed experiencing a lot of the ups and downs that we've had over here. So since you started, what do you think are the main sort of big changes that esports has had?
Well, esports in general in Australia, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think money is a big one, right? There's been a huge cash investment from all sorts of sources everywhere. You can just look at it and see how much more money is involved in terms of prize pools, salaries of not only players but people employed in the industry as well. So I think that's probably the major one, and I think that's what it sort of almost always comes back down to. Mainstream sort of starting to take notice as well, with Melbourne Esports Open, for example. Visit Victoria has a big part in that, which is obviously the tourism board of Melbourne, or sorry, of Victoria. But yeah, they obviously get involved. So governments are sort of starting to take notice, I suppose, as well. But again, yeah, that sort of still continues to boil back down to money, because money talks, and money makes the world go round, even in esports.
Indeed. So right now, do you think it's still on an upward trajectory in Australia, or do you think it's stagnated a little bit?
I wouldn't say I think it's stagnated. I think we can talk frankly about the Gfinity closure being unfortunate for the region as a whole. But aside from that, I don't really feel like anything has slowed down necessarily. You look to things like IEM, that still has sold well for the past 3 years, hasn't slowed down. Melbourne Esports Open was bigger this year than it was last year. I think those for me are the kind of the key metrics that we look at and sort of think about how the region is going. But even as far as like the leagues, the online leagues that we do get to watch, we're sort of seeing viewership numbers increase slowly. And it depends on what game you're looking at. I think Counter-Strike has not stagnated, so to speak, but there isn't that much improvement. So to speak for Counter-Strike, at least as far as the Australian audiences are concerned. But it's hard to say because we're almost always on global channels, at least as far as ESL is concerned. For PUBG, PUBG is going crazy in Australia. It's getting way better over the last year. Rainbow Six is another champion in that respect. Over the last year, they have just blitzed it, absolutely destroyed everything. And I think you can look to those kinds of games and say, okay, well, there is still viewership there and potential viewership there as well. Even if some games, for example, like Rocket League, are sort of going a little bit on the downward trend, I suppose.
So you talked about sort of Crown being a checkpoint, and then I guess the IEM Sydney events now being a checkpoint. If you look to the future, like, what would you imagine could sort of be the next big checkpoint for Australia?
It's really hard to theorize, isn't it? Because there's so many things that kind of could happen. You could see another investment from another TO, like, for example, Gfinity, what they did for DreamHack or for StarLadder or for OGN or any of those companies. If they say, hey, let's look at this Australian market and see if we can do something there, that could be the next thing where then they will have their event. I would love to see sort of another big mega event somewhere on the Australian esports calendar. I don't know where it would fit in. I don't know what game it would be for. My suspicion would probably be that it would make most sense to be a Rainbow Six event. I think that's the one that's sort of going the best at the moment, that doesn't already have one, which is like Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Overwatch already have their mega event in IEM and Melbourne Esports Open. So if Rainbow Six could find somewhere to sort of jump in there, I think that would be cool. There's so many possibilities. I think really at the moment it's just a case of trying to keep things stable, making sure that bubble doesn't burst. And people are talking a lot about the bubble at the moment. I don't know that we've hit the peak capacity just yet. But I would be quite happy to see the growth slow down a little bit, just so that we don't go a little bit too overboard and hit anything crazy. But I think there's still a lot of room to to grow in terms of reaching the same capacity and the same level that some of the international markets have. You know, you think of Europe and you think of North America, you look at wages and rates and prize pools and the tournaments that go on over there, and we're probably at maybe like 50% of that, maybe not even 50% in some respects. So I don't know that we'll ever hit it, I suppose, because of many issues that come to Australian esports and the fact that Australia is so large for such a small population.
Yeah.
You know, unless there's some massive explosion of population in Australia and we hit 50 million or 100 million people, I don't know how much further the market necessarily can go, but if it continues the way that it has, I think we're in a good spot.
Fair enough. Do you think is there any sort of impact that the Asian region has when it comes to esports on Australia? Do they sort of coincide at all, or are they much more separated?
From my experience, it's fairly separated. I don't really think that there's much that you would get from the Asian market in the ANZ market, if that makes sense. The only reason that they would sort of coincide is if our qualifiers or events sort of tend to line up, which it does in some instances with the Counter-Strike minors and that kind of thing sort of coming together. But as far as things look in Asia, again, it's very dependent on which region you're looking at, but mobile esports is becoming huge. PUBG Mobile is massive in India. It was all they were talking about when I was over there for Counter-Strike at Covex Masters. The same in Indonesia. All of the mobile tournaments are going crazy, and the likes of Counter-Strike are basically non-existent. China really loves their mobile esports as well. So I think that is obviously a vast difference from what we get here in Australia, because you know, here we're all about the PC and to an extent sometimes the console esports, but I think PC reigns supreme in Australia. In Asia, it's all about mobile esports. So we'll see whether or not that sort of has any effect on the future maybe of Australian esports. I can see it probably becoming a thing. It seems like the way that the industry is traveling. I think there'll always be a place for PC, but definitely mobile esports in those kinds of regions are just absolutely massive. The one benefit for at least for me and for ESL is that we do have quite heavy ties with the Asian region from ESL, because we are part of the APAC region. So we're doing things like the ESL Pro League APAC. We are running a lot of those tournaments that are happening over in Indonesia and in Malaysia and Singapore and wherever else we can sort of dig our fingers into. So that sort of helps. But again, you know, you look at things like ROG Masters, which doesn't happen anymore. I'm really disappointed by that. That was one of my favorite tournaments. Would love to see something like that come back, because that was a major market, at least as far as talent is concerned, for esports commentators, for us in Australia to sort of break our way into the Asian market. I think for me, that's really what I would like to see happen, is that our commentators have a bit of a stronghold then over the Asian market as far as English commentators are concerned, because there's obviously going to be those whatever language from whatever region you're talking about, but there's always a need for English commentators as well. And I think that's the market that we can move into, because that is the closest place for us. You know, it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to be able to break into Europe or North America, because there's already established commentators there, but there isn't necessarily that for the Asian market. But it's a case of getting those kinds of events like ROG Masters, Cobex Gaming, Cobex potentially, I suppose, going to do some more next year. I don't know. But those are the kinds of events that I'd like to see our commentators being able to go and do. And that'll be, I think, where we start to find our next level.
So you talked a little bit there about the mobile sort of boom that's going on over in Asia right now, and then obviously sort of speculation that might affect us in any way. So is that something that you could see happening in the future, this sort of transition into more mobile gaming, or is that going to always be more of an Eastern thing?
I think that's just going to be a global thing, to be honest. In 10 years, 5 years, probably 5 years, with how fast the industry moves,
yeah,
I think there's a really good chance that mobile esports really does start to carve its niche. It has already. As I've said, like in Asia, they love their Arena of Valor, Clash of Clans, or, I mean, honestly, I don't really know. Like, these are just the names that I hear a lot. PUBG Mobile, Crossfire Mobile, they're all huge, like massive, bigger than you would expect. But it has yet to sort of break into that Western market to a large extent. So I think that's going to be the next thing that we'll see. Probably that's going to be like the next big esport, unless something crazy comes out.
Fair enough. Now, I wanted to talk to you about some sort of speculations that some people have been having over the past, I guess, month. And those speculations were around the next Sydney event because there was some people that were on the internet and they were getting very excited about what the potential of the next event could be. Now,
Right.
yeah, in my opinion, it does seem a bit far-fetched because of the location that we're in and rules that Valve have previously set. But then again, considering what happened at the last major, maybe rules that Valve set don't exactly mean too much. But hey, you never really know with these sort of things. So there's always the small chance, the potential that it happens. I could see maybe people looking at it from like oh, look, we're over in Australia doing this massive event. And obviously, if people don't know what I'm talking about, there was speculation that the major would come to Sydney. Now, I don't know if I don't know if I'm going to ask you whether or not that's something you think is possible, or yeah.
I mean, I don't want to comment as far as an official capacity, so let's just pretend I don't work at ESL. But I would have to agree with your assumption that it seems like a far-fetched idea to me.
Yeah,
that we would get a major in Sydney.
Indeed. So what I'll ask instead is, in a absolutely insane world in which they do decide to have a major in Sydney, all right, alternate reality, what do you think that would do for not only Counter-Strike in Australia, but just esports in general? Do you think that would have a big impact on us, or not so much?
I'm not sure that it would have as big of an impact as people think it would. You know, obviously IEM coming for the first time was massive. Like that was probably the biggest individual event in Australian esports history. And you'd have to say that a major would be that as well. But I don't know that it would be the same jump from having nothing to having an IEM Sydney as we would have from having IEM Sydney and to an extent Melbourne Esports Open to having a major. Like it is another big mega event, which is fantastic. But the jump itself, I don't think is going to be as much. So I'm not sure it will bring as much publicity, as much attention, particularly mainstream, as IEM Sydney has in the past 3 years. So I'd love it to happen. Don't think it's going to happen. Wishful thinking, of course. Maybe 15, 20 years down the track when the Australian market and the Asian market as well gets bigger, because I think that's another big key factor is the Asian market, same time zone. That's where you're going to start to see things potentially fall into place for a larger scale event here in Australia. But for now, unlikely.
Yeah, I think I've always looked at it as more of a... when it comes to like expanding our region, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think it comes down to more of like what our teams are capable of achieving. Now, Renegades have obviously done really well, making the playoffs of the major twice in a row now. That's a huge achievement. But they've been out of the Australian region for so long now that I always look to Greyhound more and what their achievements are gaining, because let's say, you know, maybe they pull off a miracle. It's not actually that much of a miracle, to be totally honest, but let's say they make main stage of the next major, and by that I don't mean playoffs, I mean the main stage, right? So they get an automatic invite into the next main qualifier. If that happens, that opens up now 2 spots for Australian teams. Now, obviously, they've got to still get past their Asian counterparts, but that, in a way, does sort of really open up the potential for teams to get international experience and sort of move up in that sort of trajectory. So would you agree in the fact that a lot of our, I guess, the future of at least Counter-Strike really depends on how well Greyhounds now do in the future at their events?
I'm not so sure necessarily, because the issue for me I always find is when you start to have that success overseas, you tend to see those teams then move or stay predominantly overseas, and that doesn't come back and have that trickle down effect to Australia. Obviously, that's what happened with Vox into Renegades. They've stayed over there for a large amount of time. You're starting to get the same kind of thing with Greyhound. You know, they're not playing in the AUNZ Championship, the domestic leagues that they're playing in. I don't believe they're playing in MDL anymore.
Yeah, they are. This season they're playing MDL, yeah.
But you get what I mean. Like they're not always here. They're not always playing in our league. So you're starting to see them shift a little bit more of their attention to those kinds of international tournaments. It's just a matter of time probably before they get those international invites, and then bam, they're out of here. If they get into EPL, if they do something like that, like obviously they're going to take that opportunity. Didn't work very well for Winter Fox, unfortunately. But I think there is definitely a world in which a team like Greyhound, if they got an opportunity to play overseas for 6 months to 12 months, they'd be stupid not to take it, you know? But that doesn't help the region. That doesn't help Australia and New Zealand specifically. It does help the perception of it in international audiences. But if you lose the best team that you have here, obviously then the next team that comes up is going to be the best team. But overall, it devalues the strength of the region as a whole.
So, okay, well, I'll put it to you like this then. Do you not think that maybe... Okay, so that's always what I've looked at, right? Okay, if they start doing well, they start getting those main qualifiers, it becomes a more valuable team for a big org sponsor to pick up and have, okay, well, I've got a team now that can make it main qualifiers of a major. They've done it before. They're starting to show some solid events there. In my opinion, if we start to see more of those sort of Australian teams make it to the top tier, then maybe there's a little bit more, or there's more eyes, I guess, on the Australian region when it comes. Or do you not think that sort of would transition at all?
It does transition, definitely does. But in my experience, it doesn't last that long. Again, you can look at someone, for example, like Atletico, when they played the PUBG at GLL and they came second. There was a very good chance they could have come first. There was a lot of hype surrounding them. And we were like, great, this is fantastic. This is going to be awesome for the region. You know, everyone's going to think Australia is like a really good region, right? Because they were up there competing with the best from CIS, from North America, from Europe, and obviously being able to have a good time there. But I don't know that necessarily has translated into more eyeballs on the Australian region itself. Sure, it's helped out for those individuals, the players, and probably for Atletico, the organization as well. But as far as what we're seeing come back into the Australian region, I don't think it's made too much of a difference. You know, do you believe that Renegades fans are watching ANZ Champs? Do you believe that Greyhound fans are watching ANZ Champs if they're not from the Australian region? And I will guarantee you, not guarantee you, but I will bet you, in all likelihood, that unless they're betting on it, they're not watching it. And so I don't think that it translates. I don't think that Dick Stacey, being a superstar now that he is, if he was playing in ANZ Champs, would be bringing in any more viewers than any other individual, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's fair enough. You make good points, sir. You make good points. So I will ask you this then, because you talked a little bit there about the sort of bubble that we see sometimes in esports. Now, when you talk about a bubble, would you say it's more the Australian esports bubble, or would you say it's a global thing?
I mean, I'm not really like the guy that probably knows all about this. Like, I'm not that heavily involved in the business side, so I don't really know the ins and outs of the money and what kind of opportunities are coming and going and all that kind of stuff. What sort of sponsors are interested, endemic or otherwise. There has been a few sort of whispers, I suppose, over the past year of like the global esports bubble being a thing. I'm not sure that I buy into that necessarily. I think things are going pretty fine internationally. In Australia, I'm not so sure how much further it can grow, like how much room there really is for, let's say Gfinity were to continue going, you know, where do they go? Where do they grow? Like, how do they bring their product from what it was into something that has more mass appeal, like, for example, something like IAM Sydney? Obviously, ESL's been able to move into that market. We had a lot of the local tournaments, the online leagues and that kind of thing, and then built it into IEM Sydney over the course of a few years. But is there anyone else that can do something like that? Is there another tournament organizer, or is there even the resources that are available to do something like that without an international investment? I don't think so. I don't know that you're going to be getting that many eyeballs, short of some sort of miracle. But like, who's really going to be able to do it? LPL? I don't think so at the moment. Certainly not. Riot probably could, but they're obviously helping out with Melbourne Esports Open. They have their OPL finals there, and they're always changing their mind as to what they want to do with their season finals. Sometimes it's the arena events, or it used to be the arena events, but then they moved back to a sort of a smaller scale kind of thing in favor of a more developed league as a whole. So outside of like ESL and maybe Riot, who has the backing and who has the ability? I don't know. Ubisoft, if they wanted to do something huge for Rainbow Six, probably would need that international support from the global offices. But I could think of them really being the only other one that hasn't done it already. Obviously, Blizzard's in there with Melbourne Esports Open as well. But where does the next sort of big thing come from here in Australia? And I'm not so sure that it's anywhere but ESL.
So
maybe I'm biased, but
no, that's fair. It's fair. Obviously it's a very reasonable opinion. Now, would you say it's ever going to be possible that esports could ever reach the level of sort of mainstream sport? And I'll position that question for Australia, because obviously, you know, I'm not trying to get you to predict the worlds.
And this is like, I don't know if there's any right answer to this one, to be honest. I like to think that it would be possible. I'm obviously still in the industry because I believe that the industry can grow, and I believe that it can be a solid career path on down the track at some point. But how long it's going to take to get there is a major question, isn't it? Because I don't think it's unrealistic to believe that it can reach the same levels as some sports in 50 to 100 years, right? But is 50 to 100 years even going to matter in our lifetimes, sort of thing?
Yeah.
You know, when our children and their children have grown up with esports, that's when it's going to be big, like current day sports. But in the next 10 to 20 years, how much is it going to grow beyond what it is already? I suppose there is definitely going to be avenues for that as more and more people sort of start to get interested in esports. But that's a really hard question. And I'm definitely not smart enough to answer that for you, man. I just talk about video games.
Yeah, fair enough. So just as a, I guess, a finale then of this sort of esports section that I'm going through, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Fortnite. Now, I obviously don't know how much you know about this game, but I know that when it first came out, it was huge, right? Everybody was playing on an international level. It was big. Everybody's going, oh, this is it, $100 billion esports. It's going to be crazy. Did you see much of that Fortnite impact in Australia?
No, not at all, unfortunately. I mean, there is a lot of players. I don't know if you know, but I did the Fortnite at the Australian Open as well as a lot of other people. ESL ran that in association with Australian Open. And that was great. Like, that was fantastic. But quite frankly, that was literally the only Fortnite event that we've had in the last year. And you consider how large Fortnite is globally. It hasn't really translated into an Australian audience. It hasn't really translated into the esports audience either. And I think Fortnite does get a bad rap. And I think that's the case for almost every game. Feels like to me, every scene feels like every other scene sucks for some reason. Like they're like, oh, you know, like CSGO will be like, Overwatch is a terrible game. League of Legends is a terrible game. PUBG is a terrible game. And then PUBG will be like, oh, why would you even want to cast Fortnite? It's like, but you look at the Fortnite as a game and as the players, the skill level that they have. I think there's definitely a lot of skill expression in that game.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I just sort of feel like no one gives enough credit to other games, and it's not just Fortnite, but I feel like Fortnite is particularly shit on by everyone who's part of the esports market. And I definitely think that there is a world in which it could become a credible esport. Obviously, not here at the moment. There is a quite a large competitive community, but what we are already starting to see from that is players go overseas. Now, some of the best players in Australia, I believe, again, I'm not really in touch with that scene as much as I probably could be, believe they are playing and living in North America now. So that's sort of what you start to see when things don't really eventuate within the local scene. Those strong players move overseas, and then again, that doesn't really help us here, because if the best players are gone, no one wants to watch the players that are left here, sort of thing. So
fair enough. So talking then about like actual, I guess, the impact that certain games have on the scene, and we talked there about Rainbow Six and how much of a boom they've sort of had recently, and the surge that they've had, and then obviously Fortnite on an international level had brought quite a few more eyes into esports in general. How much impact would you say new games that come in that are quite popular have on now this is esports games I'm talking about, not the single player ones, but how much impact would you say when one of these games come out and it's huge, does that have a wave impact on esports?
I think it does, because you're going to bring in new eyes. What we see, at least in Australia with Rainbow Six, and I don't know if this translates globally, but in Australia, I think a lot of that community has sort of grown with Rainbow Six. So they weren't players in other games or spectators in other games. The commentators, for the most part, have come endemically from Rainbow Six. So I think that if you do bring a new game out and people get interested in it, it's going to bring more eyes to esports. Like, even going back to Overwatch, for an example, right? No one from Counter-Strike's watching Overwatch. No one from PUBG's watching Overwatch. No one from, I don't know what other, Dota, League of Legends. Maybe Dota and League of Legends have a little bit more of a link to Overwatch in terms of transition. Yeah. But by and large, I feel like Overwatch as a game really brought a lot of new sort of casual eyeballs into the esports sphere. And some of them obviously are going to stay. Some of them are not. But with anything, I think any new game, you're going to bring in people that are just fans of that genre of game. And once it then transitions into an esport, they become a fan of that game as an esport. And there's a world in which they may look to other esports and then become fans in general. So I think it does help.
Fair enough. So to talk about Rainbow Six, really, because I'm starting to get more and more interest into this scene, if I can speak, because it is very similar, at least in my mind, to Counter-Strike and the way that game plays. Obviously, they're both shooters. But I think the main thing that I've seen, obviously now this is no hate on Rainbow Six. I like the game. I even watch the competitive side of it whenever I can, whenever it's on Twitch. Give it a look. It's fine. But I do have some worries about the spectator or the observing situation because of the verticality of some of the maps. It can... Now, obviously, I'm still very new into it, right? So, maybe if you watch it quite a lot, it makes a little bit more sense to you. But I think, especially from a casual point of view, it's difficult to look at that and understand what the hell's going on, because you're looking at things and going, why can't these two people see each other? What the hell's going on? Where is the bomb? Things like that. It's very difficult. Excuse me. So
it's definitely not as easy as something like Counter-Strike.
Yeah. So
well, you go.
Yeah, I'll go. So I was going to ask, what do you think is there a way to fix that and make it more casual friendly, or is that not going to be possible, you think, for Rainbow?
I don't know how possible it is for Rainbow. Again, it's not one of my primary games. I do work a little bit in Rainbow Six, but I don't really know the ins and outs of the competitive scene or the game itself to really be able to give an informed opinion on what they could add or do with the spectator client to make it easier to look at. My 2 cents would probably be that I don't think it matters hugely how easy that is going to be to enter for a casual mark. Again, you can look to games like Overwatch, like League of Legends, like Dota. Those are all games that I think if you look at as a viewer that doesn't play those games, you think, what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah,
you have no idea what's going on. And yet they're some of the biggest esports in the world. Yeah, so to my mind, I don't know that Rainbow Six necessarily needs to hit that casual market. To me, it doesn't seem like a casual game in general. Whereas Overwatch, there's probably a lower barrier to entry for Overwatch than there is for something like Rainbow Six. I think that the Rainbow Six audience and the Rainbow Six demographic is going to be people that are very interested in kind of competitiveness, hardcore gaming, that kind of thing, and they actually want to try and improve and be really, really good, rather than just have a fun time and sort of mess around in the server. So I think that's kind of the market that they have to look at. Obviously, there's games like Counter-Strike that toe the line between both, which is like the ideal scenario, isn't it, right? But you're not going to get that, I don't think, out of a game like Rainbow Six. There's just way too much going on. You do need to be a fairly informed observer, I think, to enjoy it. But I think that's fine. There's plenty of games that are able to do that and hit that market. And I don't know that they're going to necessarily be able to move out of it anyway. So you might as well embrace it.
Fair enough. Did you play Battalion at all when that
No.
came out? No. Yeah, I thought I remember when that originally came out. Everybody's like, "It's the Counter-Strike killer. We're here finally."
Yeah.
And then it kind of just died off, and then Shroud started playing it, and it came back again. It was like it's had two sort of peak waves, but man, I don't know, just something about it is not allowing it to move forward. But,
I'm usually very slow to pick games up. It
yeah,
took me a while to get into PUBG. It took me a long time to get into Counter-Strike. The same for most of the games going around at the moment. You know, I'm sort of into Rainbow Six, but I don't really play Rainbow Six. So you know, for me, I'm always very hesitant to sort of invest in a game, right? Because I see it so often. I see that game, I see the Battalion, and I see the people like, man, it's only $30, buy it. You know, it's going to be the next big esport. And I'm thinking, is it? You know, like I've seen it before. I've seen games rise and fall really quickly. Apex Legends, right? How big that was when it came out.
crazy.
I had literally, it felt like almost every commentator in Australia messaging me, "Hey, Elfishguy, if you need a caster for Apex Legends, hit me up." And I'm like, what do you even think is going on here? Like, there's nothing. There's no
Set sail,
esports
Apex, let's go. That's the whole
Yeah.
ESL Studios.
I mean, look, I would have loved it, right? I had a lot of time, a lot of fun playing Apex. Me and MC were hitting, we were grinding, we were smashing everyone. We were gods at that game. But it hasn't transitioned into anything in Australia, and that's the same for so many games at the moment. I feel like you need to give games like 2 years, maybe 2 years before it really becomes an established esport, and that's when you can start to look at it from the esports side of things. So at that point, I'm kind of happy to just sort of give it a rest, let everyone else sort of pick up the pieces, figure out what the good games are and what the bad games are and what's going to be big and what's not. And then I'll sort of come in later on in the piece, and that's when I'll dedicate my time to learning and picking up any given game, because there's a lot going on, right, in my world. So I don't want to sort of hardcore invest into a new game unless it's actually going to be something that actually happens for a while, you know?
Yeah. You play games like how I watch Netflix, where I don't watch any shows unless there's at least 10 people that tell me, yeah, that show's really good. And then maybe, just maybe, I'll watch the first episode and go, why was I not watching this for the past, like, 2 years?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's in hindsight, you know, like when you do start working on those games, like I can use the example of myself in Overwatch. I casted like one of the very first tournaments was like Battle of Beta or Best of Beta or something. It was in beta. There was an esports. There was a tournament in beta. And I casted that. And then it was like 2 years before I casted Overwatch again. And I sort of, in a way, wish I was still involved with that scene for the 2 years. Would have given me a lot of more groundwork, would have given me a lot more information and inside information. And it's really good to just be involved in the scene, because you know, you have that recognition of people. When you start commentating, sometimes there is a bit of a pushback if people don't know you, right? So if you stay involved in the scene, like right now I'm thinking like, why don't I try and stay invested in the competitive Apex Legends scene? Because who knows, in 2 years I might be casting Apex Legends. But also I'm thinking, is it really worth it?
Yeah.
Because what if it doesn't? You know, I'll do that for Apex Legends. I'll do that for Battalion. I'll do that for Fortnite. I'll do that for what other games am I not doing at the moment, but could be a thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's just way too much of a time investment. And it's a little unfortunate, obviously, that is the case. My ideal world would be a game gets released. 6 months later, they're announcing their esports. They've got custom servers. Scrims are happening, competitive scenes are happening. ESL's able to do whatever they want, you know? It doesn't have to be directed by the publisher or anything like that, because that's one of the big problems nowadays, is that the publishers always want to keep a good hold on their game. It's not like Counter-Strike where you can just do whatever you want, run tournaments.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is what it is, I suppose. So
Crazy
that's
world.
just life.
Yeah, that's the thing that maybe some people don't realize is that when you're doing commentary and you're spreading yourself out over multiple games, because of the way communities look at their games, they're so... I mean, listen, even if you're in a community for 10 years, you're still going to get people in Twitch chat that are going, noob commentator, you know, all that stuff. But it's definitely... a very visual thing when you see somebody who's not been in a certain scene for a very long time moving over from another scene. You can definitely get that sort of volatile community reaction to that. So you will have to sort of juggle all these different games and make sure that you're just sort of staying in it enough where people go, oh yeah, he's been around for a little bit, and you're more accepted, I guess, into that community. So,
and I think that's one of the best ways as a commentator to sort of build your brand as well. Like if anyone asks me, what game should I be commentating right now to sort of get into? I will literally never tell you to start commentating Counter-Strike, because the barrier to entry is going to be way too high. There's already way too many people that are established. It's just not going to happen, you know? Look to a game like Apex Legends, to a game like Fortnite, to a game like even Rainbow Six, right? Maybe not quite as much to the same extent as it was a year ago, but the established commentators in Australia for those kinds of games are not that established, right? That's the kind of community that you can get into at the grassroots level and grow with the community. Everyone's going to love you. You're going to be the Rainbow Six guy. Yeah. You're going to be the Apex Legends guy. You're going to be the Fortnite guy. And people like me who will transition into that game after 2 or 3 years are going to find it a lot more difficult to get on the right side of the community, because, you know, we're not involved with the community from the outset. So that's, I think, something that can really help newer commentators come through. But it's a massive gamble, because you don't know that your game is going to be the next big game, right? So you could invest 2 years being in that scene and only for it to sort of flop, and then you're like shit out of luck because you haven't built your brand at all, and you've spent 2 years sort of wasting your time, and then you've got to go back to square one with the next game that comes along. So that's why for established commentators like myself and for other people that are sort of already pretty well known within Australia, you don't really see us jumping on those newer games, because it's just not worth the risk to waste all of that time. You know, you got to stick with the more established things, and then when something does come established, you in a way rely on your brand power to be able to force your way in, which is as harsh as it is to say. I suppose for the little guys is kind of how it works sometimes.
It's just how the world works, unfortunately. Yeah, well, so talking then about, I guess, newer commentators coming up, because there might be people watching this that maybe want to get into that. I know there's definitely, like you said, there's a large amount of people that want to get into Counter-Strike always, and I think that's obviously very good advice to, you know, listen, if you've got another game other than Counter-Strike that you're into, focus on that, you know, stay in Counter-Strike, but you've got to, it's so difficult to get into Counter-Strike because the amount of people that are in it and the amount of networking that you have to do, like, that's something that I definitely, you know, it took a long time, and something that I very slowly realized is that a lot of esports, and not just esports, but just any kind of, I guess, entertainment industry in general, it's a lot about networking and who you know, who you talk to, you know. I mean, man, like 2-3 years ago, well, it wasn't that long ago, let's say, it's about 2 years ago, that's back when I was casting MDL with bloody Mac and Rob and Conky and all that lot, and you just see these people go up to the top, and it's I always look at it and go, man, how difficult must it be right now for somebody new to make their way up into this scene? So what advice would you have then for newer commentators or people that want to get into it? Yep, there you go.
As far as, like, it really sucks, right? It really is shit that is what probably the first words out of my mouth should be, is move to Sydney.
Yeah.
But if you want, particularly in Counter-Strike, if you want to work in Counter-Strike in any capacity at live events, you have to be in Sydney.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I can look at even yourself and, for example, Conky as examples. The amount of work that you guys get versus the amount of work that Manic and Mac have now after moving to Sydney is obviously vastly different, right? And that's just a simple fact of money, right? We don't have the money to fly people from Western Australia for 6-7 weeks in a row to cast the ANZ champs. But if you're in Sydney and you're not a potato, which those guys are not, well, sometimes, but if you're not a potato, you're going to get work. So it is easy in a way to get into, but it's also difficult. So it takes some sacrifice, I think. And I hate being the guy that has to sort of, people come to me a lot of the time asking, you know, how do I get into casting? How can I cast at ESL and that kind of thing? I'm like, well, look, I can do what I can to help you, but what I can do really is not that much. You kind of have to do it yourself. If you don't live in Sydney, I'm sorry, but the chances of you getting consistent work are very, very low. So to me, that would be the first thing. You can obviously take a different route, which is something like what Conky does, where he sort of builds his own brand. He's got quite a following now on Twitch and is doing all the online sort of stuff, whatever you can pick up on GoTV and that kind of thing. But in a way, I sort of feel like that can only take you so far, you know?
Yeah.
If you want to do IEMs, you're wanting to do international events, if you're trying to break into global stuff, it's going to be a lot harder just doing that from being a bedroom streamer on Twitch than it is, I would say, from doing studio casts and live event casts.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very tough. Some games do have the budgets to sort of fly their commentators in. We look at PUBG. We fly Xenox in almost every week for the PUBG League from Melbourne. Same for Rainbow Six. A lot of the commentators, in fact, the majority of the commentators aren't Sydney based, and they fly in weekly as well. But it's just not possible in CS:GO. So either you have to find a way to get yourself to Sydney, and even then, like if someone said to me, "Hey, I'll fly myself every week to Sydney to cast ESL ANZ Champs and accommodate myself for 2 nights a week," all you have to do is pay my rate, which is what you would pay the other guys. I even would hesitate to agree to that because that feels like I'm taking advantage of someone. So unless you live in Sydney and it's not like money coming out of your pocket just to be able to work on that. Because like imagine in a year's time, right? Let's say you, for example, wanted to cast ANZ Championship. And you said, Elfishguy, I'm going to fly myself to Sydney and accommodate myself for every single night of the ANZ Champs. And then I was like, yep, let's do it. Let's pull the trigger. I'll pay you a couple of $100 a night. And then a month down the track, a year down the track, you turn that back and say, ESL's taken advantage of me. They made me pay my flights and accommodation for a whole year to do the AU and NZ Championships. And I still didn't get to do IEM Sydney. And I'm like, well, that's not really how it went. But how does that look to the outside?
Yeah.
You know? So it's a rough situation.
It's a crazy world. I will say this. If you are a commentator coming up, do not live in WA. Whatever you do.
Definitely don't live in WA.
Don't do that because you'll have to
get the fuck out of there.
Jesus Christ, the flights are so ridiculous. It is insane. But, yeah. So at least if you want to, make it a little bit more difficult for yourself, go to Melbourne, all right? There you gotta push yourself a little bit more.
Melbourne or Brisbane might be, you could probably make that work in a way. New Zealand or WA, sorry guys.
What are you doing?
I don't know what to say, but good luck.
Yeah.
I guess New Zealand has helped a little bit now because LPL is based in New Zealand. But the opportunities that you're going to get there are so minimal. Move to Brisbane, move to Melbourne, or better yet, move to Sydney. It's where the industry is. So anyone that has any aspirations, you're probably going to have to make that jump. And you can sort of look at Rob Manic and see what that has netted for him. I spoke to him last year at Melbourne Esports Open. He was doing the variety broadcast for us alongside Dev Marta, who has also risen quite substantially in the last year. And I said to him, I was like, I'm looking for more commentators in Sydney because we knew that Ian Sniper was moving to a full-time job in PwC. Well, he's got a full-time job, basically. It doesn't really matter where it is. He was going to take a back seat, wasn't casting as much. We were looking for more people to sort of fill those shoes. Mac had recently moved to Sydney, so he was obviously involved. But we were looking for sort of one more. And I said to him, if you move to Sydney, I can get you some work. I can't guarantee it's going to be enough to live off. You might have to find a second job. But you'll get some casts. And so he moved to Sydney, and now he's one of the primary commentators, obviously, for AUNZ Champs for CS. He did IEM Sydney with us, and now he's starting to move into Rainbow Six as well. So I think you can take that as an example of what is possible if you take that leap of faith, but it is definitely a leap of faith. It's a scary prospect. I wouldn't want to do it. If I had an established job somewhere, I'm from Brisbane, right? I moved to Sydney for ESL, but at the time, I was working at Woolies and I'd just finished uni. So it was the right timing for me. But 3 years down the track, now that I'm 25, let's say I had a full-time job somewhere, it's probably not a move that I'm making. Yeah. And there goes my esports career, unfortunately. But
yeah. Well, I mean, it's the fairy tale, isn't it? At the end of the day, and sometimes you gotta take the leap if you wanna make it. But listen, I still think there's hope, especially for people that want to go into Rainbow Six and things like and PUBG, especially now. Um, there's roads you can take. So if you are looking at it, don't look at it and go, oh, it's never gonna happen. If you really do work for it, I mean, you only have to look at, like you said, at someone like Rob Manic Monday, who did take that leap, and now he's working over at ESL. So it is possible for people to pull that one off. You just got to be willing to throw it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the only avenue that you can make work. Obviously, you can build your brand as a streamer as well,
Yeah,
so you can
Conky.
take the Conky route as well. That obviously also takes a lot of work because, as far as I understand, he's got a full-time job, and then he's coming home and streaming for 4 or 5 hours a night. So I'm not sure how much sleep he's actually getting.
God
but
knows.
it's just another way of finding your little niche in the esports market, and we'll see where it leads, I suppose.
Fair enough. All right. Well, let's move to the upcoming LAN event, because we have ESL AUNZ Champs Season 9 Finals coming up, and we've got a pretty good roster here actually. When it comes to teams, you've got the top. Those would be the top. Obviously, if you don't count Greyhounds, that's actually genuine. Okay, well let's say it. So it's Chiefs, Order, Avant, Ground Zero, right? That's top 5. Am I doing the math right here? Top 6.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly good tournament. Ground Zero playing quite well right now. They've come through. They got a good result over someone recently, I think. But they're obviously competing with Genuine for that sort of next spot up. Those two teams there comparing quite closely to each other. Then you have Order, who are on a bit of a slump right now, but would definitely be more motivated than ever with Justillo now in the lineup to sort of, I guess, re-establish themselves. And then Chiefs, Chiefs are doing Chiefs things. They're just doing whatever it is that Chiefs does and playing at a very high level. So, and then obviously in the 4th spot, Avant there, who are looking insanely good right now and could very well be taking that number 2 spot if they keep performing the way they are. Now, for me, I think one of the main storylines for this LAN is probably that Avant team, because if they are able to win it, that would be quite a result for them. So what are the sort of things that you're looking forward to when it comes to this LAN?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of them, especially when you look at APOC as an individual and the kind of performances that he's had at particularly ESL AUNZ Championship LANs. He was part of that Chiefs roster that went on a pretty crazy spree at some point. So he's definitely got some pedigree there. Soju, Sterling, Jira, and Hazard, maybe not quite as much when it comes to the AUNZ Championship. But like you say, that sort of meteoric rise of Avant is definitely something to look at. I think it's a case of redemption, maybe, for Order as well. Even though technically they are the defending champions, having won last season, it doesn't really feel like it, though.
Yeah.
So they kind of come into this one with some hope, at least, to be able to put something good on the board. Chiefs, I think they just continue to keep plugging away. I mean, I don't think the storylines are as compelling for Chiefs. If they win, it's like, okay, that makes sense. If they don't win, it's like, whatever. Pretty strong tournament. So not too concerned, really, where they end up, so to speak. For Ground Zero, I kind of feel like they're more of a dark horse, right? They're the one that, like, no one's really expecting Ground Zero to win. So if they did win, that would be huge. Quite frankly, if they even win a series, that'll be pretty big. But for me, it's kind of a 3-way battle for first place. And I think the most compelling storyline certainly is going to be that Avant one, and whether or not they can sort of shut everyone up, because there's certainly been a lot of discussion around them in the past few months.
Yeah, definitely. Avant have done some impressive results as of late. And so I will go break down just directly into those matchups then, because obviously we have them on HLTV, which is Chiefs versus Ground Zero. That's going to be one side. Now, as you said, I think Ground Zero are definitely the dark horse here. They have potential. They got some aimers on that team, but it's difficult when you're coming up against Chiefs, who very rarely kind of falter when it comes to these sort of matchups. So I think that particular best of 3 is going to be all about what can Ground Zero do? What maps can they get it on? And then when they do get onto those maps, how far can they push Chiefs? Because
Yeah, which of the individuals is going to have a good performance? Someone going to come through and just totally blitz the LAN.
yeah, exactly.
No pun intended, obviously. But I think that's what it's going to have to take for Ground Zero. Obviously, it's a bit more straightforward for Chiefs. Yeah, I mean, look, to be fair, Chiefs did sort of struggle last season. They did lose to Genuine in exactly that kind of a game.
Yeah.
So let's not say it's impossible. It is definitely an outside chance, though, for Ground Zero.
For sure. So it'll be Chiefs then who are most likely to make it out. But like you said, Ground Zero, there's definitely a chance there. And it is going to be the upset result that you're looking for there. But with Order and Avant, I think that one's a really fun.
That's a doozy.
Yeah, that's a fun matchup right there because you've got this storyline in that is so great that you have Order who've won the last ESL AUNZ champs. They are the reigning champs defending, but like you said, it doesn't feel like that. They've been through a slump. They've lost some players. They're coming into this tournament now with a hell of a lot to prove. They do have Justillo now in the lineup. They've had a little bit more time to sort of prac with him and get that going. So you're going to see, obviously it is still relatively soon, but I feel like you're going to see what Order's capable of, relatively at least in this tournament. So they've got a lot to prove here, but then you have Avant, who, if you've been looking at the rankings recently or the HTT rankings, there's a little bit of controversy about where those teams should be ranked. And this matchup right here is the perfect matchup to sort of decide that, right? So it's
on LAN.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's on LAN.
That adds a bit more importance to it. I think for Avant, they probably go into that feeling like they don't have anything to prove. I sort of think they feel like they've already proven.
Yeah.
But yet no one's really kind of picking up on that. So maybe for Avant, it's like literally driving another stake into everyone's head and saying, hey, listen up, what's going on here?
Yeah.
For Order, obviously, it is that sort of redemption storyline. Justillo comes in, see how they're going to build as a roster and that kind of thing. No questions, they're going to be still probably a top 4 roster, but where they sit in that top 4 still remains to be seen. That's like the match of the tournament, even probably better than the grand final, whatever it ends up being, in my opinion. I think that's the one that's going to be the most cool to take a look at.
Yeah. Well, I do want to then talk about, obviously, potential matchups, because as much as Order versus Avant is an absolute banger of a match and does a lot, especially just for the rankings of our scene and figuring out where certain teams lie, in a potential world in which Chiefs makes it past Ground Zero and then Avant sort of completes the deed and cements themselves over the top of Order, now you have a LAN matchup between Chiefs and Avant. And I know that a lot of the people, a lot of commentators in the scene have been talking about not only could Avant pass Order, but they might be willing to take that second spot and pass Chiefs as well.
I would probably say that if they do win this, I would rank them second.
Yeah. It's a LAN result, right? And it's so it would be... Yeah, I would have to agree with you, man. I think that if Avant managed to take down Order and Chiefs, that's so legit, especially on LAN, that I think it would be very, very difficult for anybody to say that they are not the second best team in Australia. So, I mean, you've got a hell of a LAN coming up here right now. So I do wish you guys the best of luck for that. I hope it's as enjoyable as it seems to be stacking out to be.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank you for coming on The Temple. I appreciate it. Here to celebrate the 20th episode. It was an absolute doozy, and I really appreciate you coming on, man.
Thanks for having me. I guess for episode 50 or 100 or something, if you get there, you can have me back. I'm sure it'll take a while to get there. So we might have some fresh opinions to talk about and that kind of thing. But I hope, look, I really enjoy coming on podcasts like this. So I hope everyone enjoyed listening.
Sweet. I appreciate it, man. And thank you guys for listening to this one. Thank you guys, if you have listened to all of them. God knows why. Thanks for listening to all 20 of these. And I appreciate you guys coming. We'll catch you next week at some point. Who knows? I don't know who I'm getting. This thing just kind of rolls off and it's like a snowball down a hill. We never know what's going to happen, where the future's going. But thank you guys all for coming, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.